Hi everyone, welcome once again to my presentation. My name is Audrey McGill Sawyer. I am a doctoral student on the DBA program at California Intercontinental University. Today I'll be talking about conducting a chi-square test of independence, also referred to as the chi-square test of association. This presentation is part of my GRC 605 course with Professor Nigel Baster. Before I get into conducting the chi-square test of independence, I will explain some key terms so that when I refer to them, you will know what I'm talking about. I will also explain my study step by step. Then I will go over each study and state my findings, which will either be to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis. My study will examine the relationship between the number of cars and the number of default payments, the relationship between the comfort level of financial standing and the number of default payments, the relationship between the number of cars and the comfort level of financial standing. I will then summarize with a few takeaways from the session and, of course, end by opening the forum up for questions, comments, or feedback. The chi-square test of independence compares two or more categorical variables in a contingency table in order to establish the degrees of association between them. The Cramer's V is a post-test tool used to determine the strength of relationship between the categorical variables in the chi-square test after the test has rejected the null hypothesis. The crosstab, which we'll come across when carrying out our analysis on the PSP software, is the PSP's term for the chi-square tests. Phi is the PSP's term for our Cramer's V test. Again, we will encounter this term when we begin our analysis on the PSP software. The data I will be analyzing in this presentation is based on a copy of the GRC 605 dataset, and the variables will be analyzed using PSP. PSP is a free online software application designed for analyzing sample data. I'll be running a number of set data through the PSP software in order to state the null and alternative hypothesis, state the rejection rule, test for association between the variables, test the chi-square test, establish the degrees of freedom, and state the Cramer's V when the null hypothesis has been rejected. Conducting the chi-square test. First of all, we import the data from Excel into the PSP software. Then we click on Analyze and select Descriptive Statistics. And we go over on our right-hand side and click Crosstab. Remember, Crosstab is PSP's term for chi-square test. We open the Crosstab table, and then over on our left-hand side, we select the variables that we are running the test on and send them over to the rows or the column test as the case may be. We then select Statistics. And once the Statistics tab is open, we simply check that our chi-square test and the Phi have been selected. We click Continue, and then over back on the Cross tab, we select OK. Let us now examine our results. The following correlational test was conducted. We examined the relationship between the number of car payments made and the number of default payments. Our null hypothesis stated there is no relationship between the number of car payments and the number of default payments. Of course, our alternative hypothesis stated there is a relationship between the number of car payments and the number of default payments. The chi-square statistics and its p-value were calculated using PSPP, assuming alpha to be 0.05. We then performed the chi-square test, and the chi-square test had 6 degrees of freedom. It contained 150 cases, and the chi-statistics itself was 6.68. The p-value was 0.351. With a p-value of 0.351, which is greater than our alpha of 0.05, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. Let us now examine our second result. The following correlational test was conducted to establish the degree of association between the comfort level of financial standing and the number of default payments. Of course, our null hypothesis stated that there is no relationship between the comfort level of financial standing and the number of default payments, while our alternative hypothesis stated that there is a relationship between the comfort level of financial standing and the number of default payments. We then performed the chi-square test, and the chi-square test had 6 degrees of freedom. It contained 150 cases, and the chi-square statistic itself was 6.68. The p-value was 0.351. With a p-value of 0.351, which is greater than our alpha of 0.05, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. Let's have a look at our final test result. The correlational test was conducted to establish the degrees of association between the number of cars and the comfort level of financial standing. Our null hypothesis stated that there is no relationship between the number of cars and the comfort level of financial standing, while the alternative hypothesis stated that there is a relationship between the number of cars and the comfort level of financial standing. The chi-square statistics and its p-value were calculated using PSPP, assuming the alpha to be 0.05. We then performed the chi-square test, and the chi-square test had 9 degrees of freedom, contained 150 cases, and the chi-square statistic itself was 450, with a p-value of 0.000. With a p-value of 0.000, which is less than our alpha of 0.05, we rejected the null hypothesis and performed a Cramer's V test to establish the strength of the relationship between the variables. The Cramer's V result was 1, indicating a very strong relationship between the variables. Now let's talk about some important takeaway from this session. The first important takeaway is to know when to use the chi-square test of independence. We should note that there are 3 different types of chi-square tests, so knowing which one to use is important. Otherwise, our results could be flawed or compromised. It is also important to know when to use the Cramer's V and the role it plays in the chi-square test. We must remember that the Cramer's V only comes into play when we reject the null hypothesis. Finally, with modern technology and technological advances, we have tools like the PSPP and SPSS to effectively and efficiently carry out these tests for us, cutting down on time, energy, and effort while guaranteeing more accurate and useful data. I hope that you have enjoyed this session and you have found the information very useful. Thank you very much for listening. And of course, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to address them at this time. My name is Audrey McGill Soyam, and thank you once again.